a Daredevil movie. Now, I apologize that Ben Affleck didn't do that great a job, but we did get a movie. That was one of the first kind of Marvel movies that we got by doing that.
Having Kevin there in the launch of Marvel Knights, having us doing like MTV and all these different shows, I think was the actual start where Hollywood started to come in, to make its way into comics, where all of a sudden, if Kevin Smith is a filmmaker and he's interested in this, maybe they'd be interested in making more movies, or maybe another filmmaker wants to write a book, or a guy who's a screenwriter wants to write a comic. I remember I was at a party with Spike Lee and Wesley Snipes, and Wesley Snipes came up to me and said, "Jimmy, come outside, I want to talk to you." And he's like, "I want to be the Black Panther. Can you make that happen for me?" So all of a sudden, people in Hollywood want to be the characters they grew up with. It was an exciting time, because we thought, well, you know what? The company's having whatever issues it's having, yet we're getting this positive press, we're making some money, and we're also getting guys, you know, actors that want to be involved, and filmmakers that want to be involved. And at the same time, Avi's running around putting together deals. You know, we're doing the work on our comics, so we're doing what we're supposed to do, is bring attention to the comics, and Avi's out there able to make deals based on the fact that people are getting more attention now to these characters. And eventually, this is the thing that would actually take Marvel and put it in a great place, and a powerful place, and in a place it deserved to be.
My biggest issue at the time was that if you want to unleash the value, we have to go to Hollywood. The X-Men show did fantastic, and one of the things it did so great was a household rating, which cannot come just from the kids. So it was very clear that you had teenagers and students watching the show. It was actually at 11:30 in the morning, which is perfect for teenagers. And it took a lot of convincing to get Fox to make the movie.
I started working with Bryan Singer as his assistant. So it was right before Usual Suspects came out. And Bryan he didn't grow up a comic book fan. He was a big science fiction fan. He had the concept of what most people had about comic books, was that it was guys running around in their underwear, and there was no deeper themes. So I said, no, it's not like that. It's Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the next wave in human evolution. And what if sometime next week there's a story on the news that there's a new level of humanity on the planet? Would we say, oh my God, our children are going to be stronger and better, they're going to deal with global warming and nuclear proliferation and make a better planet? Or would we react with fear in that Darwinian sense? And he's like, wow, okay, I like that. Marvel at that time, even though they had sold the rights for X-Men to Fox, they still had approval rights over anything that would violate the integrity or damage their copyright on the character. So we needed to get the approval of Marvel in the direction we were going to go. So went over to Marvel and met with Avi Arad and Stan Lee. And for a kid who grew up, who has 30,000 comic books, who waited for comic book day, we got to meet the Pope, you know? And Stan Lee, to any comic book fan, is the Pope. And we basically told him what we wanted to do, which was really go back away from what X-Men was doing in the comics with Age of Apocalypse, and really rooted in that Byrne, Claremont, it's a school era. So July of '96, Bryan and I wrote the treatment together, and then through 4 long and hard years, we went through development, production, and release in July of 2000.
D'un bout à l'autre des États-Unis, Marvel renaît de ses cendres. À Los Angeles, Avi Arad, promu directeur de création du groupe, négocie les futures adaptations cinéma. À New York, le PDG Ike Perlmutter appelle à la rescousse Bill Jemas pour redresser les finances de la branche édition. Avec Joe Quesada comme directeur éditorial, Jemas procède à plusieurs licenciements, mais surtout, il organise le renouveau artistique de la société.
And it was spectacular. Quesada and Bill Jemas, who had come from another arm of trading card publishing or whatever, we didn't know what to make of that alchemy. But oh my God, they set the comics on fire.
Well,
Bill James actually had a very, very interesting idea whenever he suddenly became president of Marvel, which was to start the books over again from scratch. And it was very, very clever, actually, because there had been 50 years of continuity that made it almost impossible to read the books. Because to understand this issue of Spider-Man, you had to have read this issue of X-Men 4.5 years ago and everything. It was just almost impossible for regular readers to just come in. It was starting to appeal to a very niche audience.
We created the Ultimate line, in which rather than being written like a soap opera where each issue related to the past issue, they were written 6-issue story arcs. So we would go to a writer and ask them to write Ultimate Spider-Man or Ultimate X-Men as if they were writing a movie, as opposed to if they were writing a comic book.
We all thought was an incredibly stupid idea because we were hidebound to what had come before. And we were all of the feeling of, well, how do you do it better than Stan Lee and Steve Ditko? Well, you don't do it better, you do it differently. You do it for a new time. You do it for a new audience.
Fortunately, there were a handful of writers, most notably Brian Bendis and Mark Millar, and Joe Quesada, who was running an imprint called Marvel Knights, who may not have quite believed that was going to work, but liked me enough personally to hope. These 3 creators set the tone for Marvel.
Joe Quesada phoned me up and he said to me, Mark, the lunatics are now running the asylum. Would you like to come and join us? Because he'd just been put in charge of Marvel. And I thought, how can I refuse an offer like that? And I actually took a pay cut to go and work at Marvel. I took a 30% pay cut to go and work at Marvel because I just thought, this looks quite exciting. You know, this is like going into Iraq after the place has been bombed or something. You know, the place is just, it's nuts. It's a good, or being an oligarch rising up in Russia, you know, after the fall of the KGB. And they had me lined up to do Ultimate X-Men, which was a reboot of the X-Men franchise. And I had a great time on that. I was very, very lucky. It started at #1, it launched at #1 and everything. And that gave me a certain amount of kind of credibility at Marvel. So like, it was a really exciting time. And the 5 years that followed, I think, is probably the most creatively interesting at Marvel, I would say, since maybe the 80s, but even possibly the 60s, whenever everything started.
The first Gemas years, the sales in the books exploded, the attention the books received from the outside media exploded, and comics were back on the map, and people were very excited. You're watching what Grant's doing with X-Men, what Brian is doing with the Ultimate Spider-Man line. These are must-read comics.
Marvel's all about, if your book sells well, then you know you can do anything you like, which is lovely. You know, it's a great position to be in. So because my first book had sold so well, they said, what do you want to do next? And I said, I'd love to revamp the Avengers franchise. And they said to me, people don't like the Avengers. And they showed me the sales figures. I wanted to go in and make these characters work for the 21st century. So I wrote an outline for it, and the guys really liked it. And Bill said, look, you've made us money on X-Men. You know, let's see what you can do, you know. And Joe became very, very excited about it. Joe became a real supporter of it too. And the guys, they just gave me carte blanche.
Gemas, again, had this notion of, damn the torpedoes, you know, don't tell us what to do. Let's do things in opposition. Let's push the boundaries. Let's find new ways of interpreting old rules. Let's challenge all the thinking that went before this. And Joe was very much of that same mindset. They were a good team. And that momentum, that energy, really created a new Marvel renaissance in the early 2000s.
When a big movie will come out, say Iron Man, people are like, I want to read Iron Man #1. Reading Iron Man #1 for a person who just saw the Iron Man movie is not the same thing. It was in Vietnam, there were communists, so the Ultimate Universe and the whole line of books is sort of a way to bring people that are of this time period into Marvel Comics and into these characters in a way that they can relate to, as opposed to having to go back and dig through all that continuity in history. So with the Ultimate books, one thing that you can kind of compare it to is the way the Marvel movies are nowadays, like the first movies where they're origin stories, where you're gonna see stories that are somewhat familiar to the actual original story, but they've been updated, they've changed. You know, an X-Men movie, the very first X-Men movie was like the stepping stones for all comic book movies, not just Marvel movies. X-Men was like this, these characters can be real, this world can feel real, and this is how we're gonna do it.
X-Men was, I think, the first movie for my generation, our generation, that younger generation at the time, which really took comic books seriously.
X-Men was the first step towards being able to do Spider-Man, being able to do Captain America, being able to do Iron Man. That was the seed from which the whole Marvel movie universe sprung.
Well, I think the first X-Men showed two things. One, you could make these movies cheap with almost nobodies or very, very low voltage stars in them. Hugh Jackman was not the most well-known guy when that movie came out. You know, Halle Berry as Storm was not the most well-known actress, certainly hadn't been an Oscar-winning actress at that point. And secondly, you could make them that they appealed to all genres and demographics. Yet those movies were able to make enough. They were able to make enough, they were able to capture the attention of the public, and they were able to inject what had been a relatively minor comic book series in the general landscape. Comic book fans knew who X-Men was, but the general public were not very familiar with the X-Men.
You know, it was interesting. Avi had told me that the success, and this was the week before we're supposed to open, and he said, if X-Men doesn't do well, Sony's not going to greenlight Spider-Man. Fortunately, we did, you know, amazing that weekend, and that Monday, there's a big announcement in Daily Variety of Spider-Man getting its green light.
We see Spider-Man. Oh my God, they got it. This was the first time anyone had done a Marvel property on television or the movies where they weren't embarrassed by the source material. In fact, they embraced the source material and they made what was in the comics that we loved work. Were there changes? Yeah, there's always going to be changes when you move anything from one medium to another. You have to. But, oh my God, they got it right. That's Uncle Ben. That's the speech. With great power comes great responsibility. He's sewing his own costume. He's fighting a wrestler. There's the burglar that he doesn't stop to save his uncle. All the beats were there, all the magic moments were there. We all walked out of it knowing if this is the approach they're going to take, then this is going to work. And we all held our breath that weekend, because if that movie had failed, that would be it. There'd be no more superhero movies. And that was the turning point. The Spider-Man movie being as good as it was, that opened the door for everything.
Spider-Man rapporte plus de 800 millions de dollars dans le monde, rien qu'en salle. Hollywood reçoit le signal, les super-héros attirent les foules. Et grâce au progrès des effets numériques, tout devient possible. Entre 2002 et 2007, 5 studios sortent une quinzaine de films adaptés des licences Marvel. Mais les faibles royalties reversées sur les bénéfices poussent Arad et Perlmutter à changer de stratégie. Plutôt que de laisser Hollywood adapter son catalogue, Marvel reprend un contrôle absolu sur les films via sa nouvelle filiale Marvel Studios. Arad et le président de Marvel Studios, David Maisel, obtiennent de la banque Merrill Lynch un prêt de 525 millions de dollars pour produire une dizaine de films.
The Spider-Man movies made what? The first two made $1.6 billion. Marvel only made $75 million on that deal. So that wasn't acceptable to Perlmutter. That wasn't acceptable to Rod, and especially Maisel. So they figure out a way to get this line of credit so they can make their own movies out of their own characters on their own terms, which is what everybody in Hollywood chases these days.
I felt very strongly that we needed to start with familiarity. And Hulk was in Universal, and it was an opportunity to start over. And that's how I went after Louis Leterrier and what it took to get him, and finally got him. And He'll always say, and then you left me.
Au départ, Marvel Studios n'existait pas. C'était Marvel, c'était vraiment une idée de faire quelque chose de différent au sein de ce système américain. Et donc de faire après vraiment comme un film indépendant, mais à hauteur de 580 millions, pour faire 2 films, pour faire Iron Man et Hulk, de rebooter Hulk sans faire une origin story, essayer de respecter le film d'Ang Lee, mais d'en faire quelque chose de différent, tout en réintégrant Hulk à l'intérieur de l'univers Marvel et puis dans la suite logique de ce qu'on voulait faire, et Avi et Kevin, c'est-à-dire créer les Avengers en fait. Et ça depuis le départ, on le sait.
Was it a strategy? Yes. Was it a strategy that worked? Yes. The first Iron Man movie has a lot more jokes than it has him in the outfit, because they're playing for something. They're playing for type. They're playing with that character, that improbability that Downey has, that made it seem so accessible. That was a lot of what led to that success. Were they smart with a second-tier character? Of course. Were they really smart insofar as by that secret ending, they knew that they were kind of planning something bigger? Yeah. Was it a Stalinist 5-year, 10-year plan? I don't know.
Arad always had a vision that the future of Marvel laid in movies, okay? So basically, there was a falling out, I think, between Perlmutter and Arad. David Mizell was becoming more of the favorite son to Perlmutter than Arad. Arad felt shortchanged, so when he set up the line of credit for Marvel, so you know what, I'm not gonna deal with this anymore. I'm not the favorite son anymore, so I'm gonna take $59 million, cash out my options, and leave the company. And that's exactly what he did.
There were a lot of things I wanted to do that would have been a conflict under Marvel. And there was a time in my life, in 2006, where I felt it's all in place. And I think I was tired enough to do the right thing, to say, Sophie, I've gotta move on, or gotta move back.
The good news is Marvel was saved. The bad news is we've been saved by Dr. Doom, and he controls now.
Ike, if you meet him, is a very short guy who dresses very snappy in a very slick little suit. And he came around and was introduced to everybody. And then people started disappearing. He did away with the free coffee. He canceled the Christmas party. He started haranguing people for Xeroxing on only one side of the paper. He's a very tight with the nickel kind of guy.
It's a true story. He would go through the halls and he would look at people's offices and he would look for paper clips on the floor and he would pick them up and hand them back to you and insist that you not waste his money this way. He would literally go around looking for paper clips on the floor to reuse. This is the level of respect that the editors felt they were getting. That's absurd. This is, talk about feeling micromanaged.
I think have just one photograph of him ever be found. That if you Google Ike, you will find this one photo that I think was taken in 1989 or something like that, and that's an incredible feat.
Je l'ai vu une fois à l'avant-première d'Iron Man avec une perruque bouclée, des lunettes de soleil et une fausse moustache. Il était au 10e rang en train de manger du popcorn. Steven Broussard, qui était le coproducteur, est arrivé et a fait regarde, c'est Ike. Il y a des légendes, c'est à l'intérieur de Marvel, il y a des légendes. On dit attends, Ike porte toujours un pistolet sur lui, toujours, chargé. Tu dis pourquoi?
Ike Perlmutter reste seul maître à bord. Grâce au triomphe mondial d'Iron Man, Marvel Studios s'impose définitivement à Hollywood. Entre 2002 et 2008, le chiffre d'affaires du groupe a quasiment triplé. Il repose désormais à 80% sur la vente de produits dérivés et sur le cinéma. À l'été 2009, Perlmutter négocie dans le plus grand secret le rachat de Marvel par Disney pour plus de 4 milliards de dollars. L'annonce est officialisée le 31 août. Perlmutter conserve son poste de PDG et nomme Kevin Feige à la tête de Marvel Studios, qui pulvérise le box-office en 2012 avec Avengers. Sous Disney et Perlmutter, Marvel accélère sa mutation en empire multimédia contrôlant ses projets au plus près.
It was a surprise to the entire comics industry the Monday morning that we all opened up our web pages and visited our websites to see what the news was and found out that the Disney empire had taken over Marvel. It was not a good feeling at first. Not that the folks at Disney aren't fine people. You're going to get me fired. But it's that a sense of a corporate takeover like that always leaves everybody a little nervous. What happens to the people who we are working with? Is there, are they going to be redundancies in the divisions where they're going to want to fire people that we like? Are they still interested in publishing comics? We don't know.
We were able to break what their secret announcement was, what their secret movie was for 2014, the secret Marvel movie. And it was Guardians of the Galaxy. So we leaked that out before the mainstream press. So the mainstream press, the Hollywood Reporter, Variety, gave us the credit for breaking that story. Marvel didn't like that. They didn't like that this quote-unquote fanboy site broke the news, of their exclusive before Comic-Con. They were furious. They wanted to know who our sources were. They've made they've made empty threats, that if you tell us who your sources are, we won't prosecute you, we won't do anything to you, we won't harm you, basically. Because not only did we break the Guardians of the Galaxy, they tried to enforce us, they tried to bully us, and then it blew up in their faces because it was now public. It was awesome, it was beautiful. Since then, they took in a very, very antagonistic stance with us.
Now, for better or worse, Marvel is owned by Disney. It's a multinational corporation. Every statement, every interview, everything that Joe Quesada and editor Axel Alonso and any of these people do, they have to be aware that they've got big mouths, looking at them. They don't want to step over any sort of lines.
Let's be honest, a studio that was kind of almost thinking about closing its animation division in the 80s to owning ABC television, to owning vast resources, to having theme parks all over the world, to buying Pixar. Then you have the acquisition of Marvel. And more recently, you've had the acquisition of Lucasfilms. So Disney is being a very smart corporate entity. They're just buying the best. And they don't have to do half the work. Because when you buy Pixar, you've got John Lasseter and his team. When you buy Marvel, you've got a long history, as this store and many of them around the world show, of already created characters with storyboards and histories and identities and lovers and backstories and villains. You're buying Lucasfilms? Well, you already get Han Solo in the deal. Actually, you get Indiana Jones as well.
Disney's, global. And with that global comes power, and I think the idea that you can launch a film like The Avengers all over the world at once. I like the idea that in India, The Avengers is playing and kids want Spider-Man toys and all this kind of stuff. So I try to look at it as a very positive thing. Where I was around when they were in Chapter 11, I'm thinking, oh, what's the chances that that's gonna happen again? Probably slim to none. With this kind of security there, I think now a lot of experimentation can come, and I have a real positive outlook on how it's going to really affect.
It's the best of all possible worlds. There is no edict that comes down that says, okay, Avengers made $1 gajillion. Now we want the comic to be exactly that. Disney's great about that. Marvel's great about that. They understand that the strength is not in what we're publishing now. The strength is what we're going to be publishing 6 months from now or 12 months from now as well. In other words, you have to let creative do its magic. And I gotta say, and I'm not just saying this to keep my job, so far so good.
In this, we keep our most expensive comic books in this vault. Most showrooms, you'd go into the world of comic books, there aren't even any of the showrooms. But if you were to go in a showroom somewhere else in the world, maybe they would have a Batman #1, a Superman #1, maybe one action #1. My company, we have 2 copies. I'm holding in my hands over $1 million worth of comic books.
Comic books in the modern format started in the early 1930s. And by the modern format, I mean the staple-bound comic as we know today. They were actually created as a way to reprint material that had appeared in the newspaper comic strips and didn't actually feature original characters at the very start. And the golden age of comics, as we know it, was started in June 1938 with Action Comics #1, the first appearance of Superman. And then a year later, he got his own series, Superman #1. And the reason Superman #1 is so important is the entire comic was only devoted to Superman. There were no other characters, and it was considered risky because Superman wasn't a character from the strips. He was created strictly for comic books. And when that was a huge hit, that showed publishers that it could be lucrative to create new characters only for comic books, and that those could be top sellers.
That began the comic book renaissance that exists to this day. That catapulted DC Comics into being the forefront, the main player. Marvel was sort of the second place company at that point. During the 1940s, 1950s, they were doing knockoff comics. If Westerns were big, Marvel would do a bunch of Westerns. If romance comics were suddenly big, they'd do nothing but romance comics. They didn't have a vision, they just had an imperative to imitate what other people did. They also had Captain America, Human Torch, Submariner, a few superheroes, but they didn't have the outreach. Those characters were not perceived as popular as Superman and Batman. And so DC held the torch until about 1960, 1961.
So the Golden Age basically means the World War II era. As far as their value, at the beginning the answer was zero. They were considered disposable entertainment. Most of them got thrown away. And also during World War II, there were always these patriotic paper drives that encouraged everyone to bring in old paper to be recycled to help the troops fighting the war. And so what did all mothers and fathers think was the worst junk to get rid of? Comic books were high on their list. So it's not a matter of 99% having been thrown away. It's actually more than 99% that were thrown away.
The concept of teenagers having their own lives, having their own interests, this was not a conceit of the 1930s and 1940s. Kids just became grown-ups. By the time you hit the 1960s, older kids, teenagers, they are more independent than they've ever been in American society with this generation. And they're looking for more entertainment. And they don't want just kiddie stuff like Superman and Batman was perceived as, and rightfully so, as written specifically for either 8-year-olds or really stupid adults. What happened during the 1960s, during what we call the Silver Age of comics, is that DC was still publishing successfully Superman, Batman, comics like this, but their momentum was slowing down very quickly because they were still publishing the same kinds of stories that they'd been publishing since the 1940s. And America was growing up, America was changing. Kids were changing. 1961, Stan Lee, who had been the editor-in-chief at Marvel forever, he started at 17 when he was a kid there, during the war years. So Stan got together with Jack Kirby, and they created the Fantastic Four. And I cannot overstate what a benchmark that was in comics publishing, because what Stan and Jack brought to the table with Fantastic Four was characters that had more depth. Suddenly, we had characters who didn't necessarily like their powers, who didn't perceive themselves as superheroes, who thought of themselves as monsters or freaks, and in doing so, kicked off the Marvel Age of comics. The success of Fantastic Four begat Spider-Man, begat Thor, Hulk, Iron Man, Captain America becomes revived and instilled in the 1960s. What Stan and Jack did, what Marvel did, was they gave this new audience of teenagers something they could relate to. Suddenly, these characters had problems and conflicts that they could understand. Superman's biggest problem was, I need Lois Lane to stop trying to figure out that I'm Clark Kent. This is not a problem that anyone of any age can relate to. But Spider-Man having to choose between fighting Dr. Octopus or getting Aunt May's medicine back to her at home before she has a heart attack, that's a problem that everybody can understand because everybody has a relative in their family who needs care. And that changed the face of comics in America.
From about 1968 onward, that's when the mainstream started to become aware a little bit of